Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode. I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Tony Magliocco, CEO of Protean Biodiagnostics. How are you today, Tony?
I'm fantastic. Thank you for having me on your program today. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited about what you're doing. I've been following you a little bit on LinkedIn and just fascinated by the science. But let's just start by having you tell us about your journey. I know you've led diagnostics at major cancer centers prior to founding your company. But what motivated the transition?
Yeah, so I've always been somewhat curious. Even as a kid, I got really excited about science. Got my first microscope way back when I was like 8 years old, and started looking at everything. But I also fell in love with medicine, and I trained in Canada at University of Alberta, and I wanted to see where I could put science and medicine together, and that really came together in the area of pathology. So pathology is where really all of the diagnostics are made, and that's where all of the technology advances are occurring. And that was way back in the 80s. And there's been a lot of advances over the years in genetics, in molecular diagnostics, and most recently in artificial intelligence and computation. So over the years, I found myself in a variety of roles. I was a frontline doctor in a variety of cancer programs. I ran a research lab. I gradually went up the ranks and became directors of labs and directors of departments, and found myself in Florida back in 2011, where I was recruited to be head of pathology at the Moffitt Cancer Center. And Moffitt is a great cancer center in the US. It's one of the larger ones. It's a NCCN designated center. Sees over 75,000 unique patients a year. It's huge. Runs over 500 clinical trials at a time. So it's a really cutting
Mm,
edge center in Florida. It's one of the biggest centers in Florida. And there, really, the advances were being implemented and put into direct patient care. So we were doing genetics, we're doing liquid biopsies, and also computational biology. It's one of the first centers that actually had a division of cancer computational
mm,
biology. And they recruited mathematical experts. And the head of the center said it was kind of funny that they were the lowest startup costs he ever had,
right.
that most scientists want $1 million lab and they want machines that cost millions and millions of dollars. Whereas, so these guys, all they wanted was a conference room, a blackboard with chalk, and a giant espresso machine. So
Right.
that's what they needed to do the modeling. So that was quite interesting. But you asked what drove me into this. So I saw that a huge amount of advances were being made that could really impact care of patients, but they weren't being implemented. There's this kind of gap in from the discovery. We know a heck of a lot about cancer and about how to treat it, but for some reason, the majority of cancer patients are still being treated with outdated therapies, with outdated ideas, with outdated approaches. So can't we do something to fix this? And that's what really drove me saying, I think we can. I think solving cancer is a data problem.
Mm.
It's really about connecting things. It's really about informing doctors how to best diagnose and treat their patients. So that's what drove me into this world that I'm in now.
Fascinating. So you had a very kind of unique perspective, right? Given the number of clinical trials that you were running, given the resources that you had, and very, very interesting.
Yeah, it became progressively more complicated because, back in the old days, it was just like there's cancer, there's not. We use chemo, we use surgery. Whereas over the last, I'd say the explosion really started happening in 2000 when we completed the Human Genome Project, because suddenly we had all of this information of over 22,000 genes, and we know hundreds and hundreds of them play a role in cancer. And there's a convergence of being able to sequence genes, and also an explosion in computational capacity to be able to manage all of that. And then what's really happening more recently are things like image analysis,
Yeah.
where those were the fields that humans had to do, pathologists. Unfortunately, pathologists make a lot of errors when they're because they're humans and they're fallible, and they get tired and distracted and stuff. But having machines help pathologists can really improve diagnosis and make things safer and more accurate. So we're really living in that time now. It's
Excellent.
very interesting stuff. Yeah.
So was there a specific problem in cancer diagnostics that you set out to solve with Protean that wasn't being addressed, Tony?
Yes. The problem is data integration. The problem is there's only one patient, but there's 50 different kinds of tests. And what we were finding is that most cancer patients would not get the right test, or they would get a test that was inappropriate, and that the doctor would quite understand how to use the information, and almost invariably give them the wrong treatment. And this is kind of worrisome. If we look at the data at Moffitt, we would review every case that came in from outside because we saw a lot of cases come in, and we'd review the pathology before we started treating them. We found that the error rate was quite substantive, that is as high as 30 to 40% of cases
Wow.
were in some way misdiagnosed, and many more didn't have the right tests done. So what it meant was that the patients didn't really have the best treatment options because they didn't know what they were. And this actually prompted a bunch of studies at ASCO, that's the main cancer group, and they discovered that in lung cancer, more than half of patients, actually 68% of patients, were not getting the right treatment, even though this treatment was around for more than 10 years. So it's one of the first targeted therapies for EGFR. So EGFR is a gene that gets mutated in about 12% of lung cancer. But if you know that they have that mutation and you give them a treatment, they can go into remission for up to several years.
Wow.
So it's important to diagnose that at the beginning. And it wasn't happening, that most patients weren't getting that. It's like, why is that not happening? It's like there's this kind of gap that the doctors didn't remember to order it, or they didn't know how to get it, or they didn't know what to do with the results. They actually found 7 gaps in there. There's a big unmet need, I felt, in particularly outside academic centers, because in academic centers, although they're not perfect, they've got the teams there. So there's a surgeon and radiation, everybody's there, and they kind of are able to work up to date. But out in the community where 80% of patients are treated, often their doctors are isolated, their surgeons somewhere, their oncologists somewhere else, and the patient is sort of like moving around, and the oncologist doesn't have all the information they need. So there's a real unmet need here of trying to deliver multidisciplinary care to the community. And I sort of recognized that and said we could solve this problem by having a proper telemedicine system, a centralized lab, making the information testing easier, organizing it in a way that would be digestible to the doctor. So we created something called Protean Mass.
Hmm.
It's a data platform. So I got some of the best software engineers I could find to be my friends from a long time back in Canada, and had them help program a cloud-based solution that would be able to manage all of the medical data for a patient, but keep it secure, because we have a couple of issues. One, we've got all these different kinds of data, like everything from typed notes to scribbled notes, X-ray images, pathology stuff, treatment data, all of these different kinds of data buckets. And we want to keep that data secure. And then we also want to make it available so that we can integrate it and then use it to guide care. So we spent a lot of time building this cloud-based data system that is both secure but also useful, meaning that it can move data in and out of health records, and that it's so-called interoperable so that that data can move around. So this is sort of our premier platform. It allows us to really take on a patient or a practice or even a system, pull all their data in and organize it for each patient, and then identify where is this patient on their cancer journey. And that's another way of thinking about it. Like I've done so much cancer work over the years, I view cancer as a journey. There's actually a journey from the moment you were conceived, because sort of the dice is thrown. Then you've got certain genes that you may be at higher risk or lower risk. And then as you go through your life, you get exposed to things like maybe you're a smoker, or you have to work in a nuclear submarine, or you're exposed to things so that the risk of you getting diseases go up over time. But we can measure that if you're at different time points. Say, okay, we know what you're at risk of, we know what you're exposed to, and then, wow, we can detect cancer at the earliest stages. And if we could cure it at that point. The problem now is that we're not getting it until it's really late and very, very hard to treat, very expensive to treat. So thinking of it as a journey is important. How do we go earlier in the journey to prevent it? Because now we have certain vaccines that can stop cancer, like HPV and others. And early detection, if we can get colon cancer at stage 1 or 0, it's curable. But also, if you properly diagnose a cancer, there's effective treatments that are now available, like I was telling you about the lung cancer or immune therapy. And even if the cancer comes back, there's trials and so on that are highly effective. I think a good example is if we look at Jimmy Carter, who recently passed away back in, I think it was 2006. He was one of the first people. He had something called metastatic melanoma. And when I was in med school, if you had that, you die in a month or 2 months. He had it in his brain, and they put him on a trial with an immunotherapy, and it basically disappeared. And he lived another 15, 20 years to be I think it was 101
Yep.
or something. So it shows you the power of these new therapies. So matching people the right therapy is there. So my goal was to create a company that could close that gap so that the tools would be there for the doctor to really take ultimate care of the patient, and ideally so that the patient could stay wherever they are in the country, that they wouldn't have to come to our lab, that we could actually treat them with telemedicine and guide their care around the country and around the world for that matter. So that's our vision at Protean, to really be able to support patients and doctors really anywhere. And we've built a system that's highly scalable, so it can plug into a practice or even a health system or a region. So that's our vision, to try to make medical care better and more accessible, and really put innovations forward faster.
Wow, that's fascinating. What an inspiring vision.
Oh, thank you.
So tell us a little bit about your journey now, bringing your company to life, from
Right.
acceptance of the product to commercialization. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's been an 8-year journey, and wasn't quite. Always had sort of the idea of how do we create this? How do we create it as a lab, and how do we build it? So I started generating revenue very quickly, because I sort of grew up in ice cream shops and restaurants, and labs seemed very comfortable to me, that we could provide services and generate revenue and so on. So right at the beginning, we created a small lab, said we had to get a license for it, and then we started providing services to pharma. So pharma needed certain specialized testing. So I was able to set up this testing, and it really built on my years working in clinical trials. That fortunately, I had a lot of networks and connections. So some of the big pharmas, was working with Roche. They were running a clinical trial. They needed a lab that would be able to do some cutting edge testing. So I was able to get a contract from them to do that testing. It allowed us to really build our capacity to support clinical trials. So started looking, and there's an increasing interest in opening clinical trials in rural America and underserved places, because they want more different populations, African Americans, Latinos, different groups. And so Protean started saying, let's try to get more of these centers on board to run these studies. So we managed to get a few trials set up, and then we were fortunate enough to be the central organizing company, our CRO, so we could go out and start recruiting these centers. Of course, it was the beginning of COVID then and all of that, so that was one of the challenges that held things up. But by starting with that, it allowed us to build the lab. It allowed us to actually connect with centers and build the initial network. So that was the first thing that we did to put it together. The next thing, we started looking at how do we provide services to cancer patients? What's really needed? Access to this specialized testing. So we're saying we needed to create a specialized test menu that would distinguish us from others. So we also have a very busy research division where, in my background, I worked with many emerging biotech companies to bring research tests into clinical use. So many companies started coming to us and say, we've invented a test to rapidly diagnose lung cancer, or we've got a tests that will detect cervical cancer earlier or cheaper. So we started getting a group of affiliated companies that had really unique technology that wanted to bring it into the US market. And they really had two choices. Would they build their own lab, or could they partner with a lab like ours?
Yeah.
So they started seeing the advantages of partnering with us because we had the data platform, we had the client networks, and then we had the lab. So we could take in their product, position it, and already have a place to start selling it to. So it became very attractive, and we started getting many companies coming to partner with us. It gave us access to unique technology and really allowed us to build a new kind of differentiated menu that centers became quite interested in. So we have some very unique tests that no other center has. So we've got a brain tumor classification test that NIH developed. It's needed by children. It's needed by brain programs around the country. Because they don't want to set it up at their own place, they're happy to use it at a centralized place like Protean. And we have dozens of centers now using us for those kinds of testing. So that allowed us to kind of build our business. But remember at the beginning, I said it's still about the data. So it allowed us to start making our data more rich. It allowed us to start looking at working with AI companies. How do we start leveraging AI? And it created a data foundation that we didn't have to produce all the data ourselves. We could actually acquire data from elsewhere, organize that data, learn from it, and make it available to other clients that needed it. So we found ourselves somewhat in a privileged position in that we could provide specialized testing. We had a platform that could organize and distribute data, and we were very central to patient care in this unmet need in the community centers, in remote areas. So we found a niche where our services were in demand, and this allowed us to sort of grow to where we are today, and then create somewhat specialized products. So saying, how do we take care of, for example, people who get cancer? So one group that we're very interested in are firefighters.
Yep.
So firefighters, their number one cause of death is occupational cancer, and they get it because of exposure to toxins, and
Sure.
also fire suppressants are highly carcinogenic. So we're in discussions. We've got some new cancer screening. We could maybe take better care of firefighters, detect cancer earlier. If they do have cancer, they often get really unusual kinds of cancer. There's 21 kinds of unusual cancer they get. So could we organize that and then connect them to treatment experts? What we do at Protean, we don't do any treatment. What we do is the diagnosis, organize the data, and then connect them to treatment programs near them or experts. So we can really pull that together with the telemedicine platform. So that's sort of how we got to where we are today.
What about the AI component of your solution, Tony? How have you incorporated that? How do you sort of test it to make sure that the AI is not hallucinating, providing reassurances to your customers and your patients that, whatever. I mean, AI is amazing, but
Mhm.
still
No,
new.
no, it's a fantastic question, and we use AI in everything that we do.
Yeah.
So we think of AI more in terms of not as a global AI, but as tools. So there's different sorts of AI tools in the AI cupboard. So some of the ones that are fairly like low-hanging fruit that we're using is looking at pathology images. So you have to look at, say, a slide of breast cancer, and then you have to stain it with a certain stain, like for a marker, like estrogen receptor. It's really important that you measure that correctly because it'll determine whether or not a woman will get certain types of therapy. And those therapies can be used for 5 or more years. So you want to be accurate about that. So now there are AI algorithms that can look at an image like that and actually make a diagnosis. And as a human, you can look at it and say, well, I kind of agree with it. It seems to be counting the right things and so on. So those are the more rudimentary AIs that you can utilize for a very specific task, and you can monitor it. Because we are in a clinical lab, we're under very strict regulatory. So we have licenses from CLIA, which is basically a government authority that regulates labs, saying you have to have certain credentials to be able to do diagnostic work for patients. So you need a medical director, you need trained staff, you need to have protocols that are inspected. So when we put in a new procedure like an AI, we actually have to put in a plan and say, how is this thing going to be used? How are we going to show that it's working correctly? How are we going to monitor it? And if something goes wrong, how are we going to fix it? So it's quite a regulated industry. So we map all of this out with these tools that are coming in. And so it is safeguarded that way. Now the image tools are a bit easier. Now there's new ones on the language side that are quite intriguing. We're a little bit more cautious about those, but one area where there's a big need is in looking at patient medical records. So when a patient comes into us, we often get patients that are coming in from all different places, and they may come with a very, very unstructured medical record. So they may fax us 1,000 pages or drop these PDFs and all of this stuff in a very, data bundle that's very, very hard to parse. And we're learning that AI tools could actually look at that and pull it apart and figure things out and say, these are the pathology reports, these are the treatment, and it could pull out the salient data and organize it in a very effective way. So we're seeing opportunities there where the AI can, structure data and kind of you can make it do that. Once it's done that, you could maybe actually have it start thinking about how might you use that data to plan a treatment, or what would you do next. And our data scientists are very strict with the AIs. The AIs have to be really put into context. The context is very important, that you want to isolate the AI. You may want to train it on your own data. And I've been explained, you have to give the context to the AI saying, imagine you're a pathologist, or imagine you're a doctor and you're trying to analyze this data or look at these guidelines. How might this data be linked to these guidelines? So it needs to be very carefully trained, instructed, and managed, because as you said, it can really go haywire. And I don't think we can let it run around on its own yet.
Right.
Although it's kind of interesting because my data scientists are saying, well, it makes errors. Well, every human does
Right.
as well. Every trainee I had makes errors, so that's not expected. It's complicated data, and I'm finding the AIs are generally as good as a trainee, that they can really help do some of those things. And I think that one of the advantages of AI is because you can then put in more and more data, and it's somewhat tireless, so that you could, it could learn from these patients did well, these patients did poorly. What are the things, the factors that help drive a patient, and so on. So that's interesting. Another area where we're using AI is to see things that humans can't. So one of the things I was telling you about was looking at the brown stains in a breast cancer. Like humans can count those, and an AI can count them, and you can kind of say, okay, I agree with you. Counted 5. I see 5. So that's all good. There's another thing that we're training AI to do, is predict the future. So there's a condition called Barrett's esophagus, and this is where if you've ever had heartburn. So it's common in people, if you get overweight or if you eat too late at night, you'll get the burning in your stomach, and that can lead to cancer. It leads to changes in your stomach and in your esophagus. But the problem is that you do a biopsy and look at it and say, well, it's changed, but I don't know if it's going to go to cancer or not. So people have to go for these biopsies all the time. So we worked with a group and said, we've got all of these ones that progressed to cancer and these ones that didn't over 10 years. Let's try to see if the AI can figure out the difference.
Wow.
So the AI looked at them all, and then it came to a conclusion. Yes, it could tell them apart.
Wow.
So we created an algorithm that could then look and say, I think this one's going to become cancer and this one isn't. The challenge with a human, I can't look at it and say, well, they both look the same to me. So it's hard to know if that's true or not. And that's where you have to do those experiments or look at the data. How good is it? Is it making errors? Do you have to update it and so on as well? So there's many facets. There's another AI tool we use. It's called Cure Match. And it's from a company that looked at combinations of treatments. So if you take the information and put it into the model, for a patient, the model will consider millions of combinations of therapies, millions of them, and then it will rank them and say, I think these ones are going to be the most effective for this patient based on my review of everything that's out in the literature and this particular patient and so on. So these can be helpful. The thing is because I think the risk isn't super high there because saying, well, I don't know what to use anyway as a doctor, but if the AI thinks it's more this way than that way, then maybe I go along with it because I wouldn't have known one way or the other. So you could do the study and say, well, it's pointing it this way. Let's try it. We could do a study and say, how did it do compared to someone that's not using that tool as well. So there's that. There was one interesting study, I think it was published recently, where they had some medical oncologists work with an AI. And so they had them evaluate patients and plan treatment for them. And then another set of oncologists reviewed them to see if the treatment was good or not. So they had the AI work by itself. They had the medical oncologist work by itself. And then the oncologist worked with the AI. And they found that the AI was the best.
Wow.
And then the oncologist was the worst. And then
Wow.
the oncologist and the AI was just as bad. And it was the
Whew.
oncologist was overriding the AI's opinion.
Right, right, right.
So anyway,
Fascinating.
yeah.
Fascinating, fascinating. Wow. So this has been just a very unbelievable, inspirational interview, Tony. Just to wrap up, what advice would you have for CEOs of healthcare AI companies? I mean, obviously, it's a very complex intersection of technology and medicine. Maybe some of the two or three of the big lessons that you've learned over time that you could share.
Yeah. I think number one is being really clear on the problem that you're trying to solve so that you know if you've solved it or not. So you really need to be quite clear about what it is exactly you're trying to do. And often this happens in research is that you need to know when to stop. So it's important that you set out at the beginning, what is it you're trying to do? And then also realize there's no perfection, that you need to get version one. So you say, okay, this is what I'm trying to do. Here's version one. It's not perfect, but it's good enough. We'll validate, see how it works, and we're going to make a version two. So I think about setting clear structure in terms of the stepping stones is very important. Otherwise, you could keep analyzing data forever, analysis paralysis, they call it. So in terms of getting that is important. The second thing is also being cautious about AI, that AI, certain models can make stuff up and that can guide you astray. So you do need to be really cautious about how you're using it and verifying it, like Reagan, trust but
Yeah.
verify, that you need to verify that it's working correctly. And then also really getting, experts that you can trust that understand how to do it. And I think there's also a lot about how do we validate these models, like putting the code together, how do we lock it down? And this is quite important in medicine, saying we need a locked version
Yeah.
so that if something goes wrong, that we know what happened and when did it go wrong so that we can go back and correct it. So there's a lot of discipline in medicine where you need to lock that. But the challenges are in computational medicine is that we're new to this, that it's different than a medical device. So we are seeing, movement by the FDA now, a medical software or software as a medical device, AI, how do we validate it and make it work? How is it used in labs? How do, a lot of doctors are threatened by it as well, but I think it shouldn't be threatening. It
Oh,
could be
no.
very useful to make us more, safer by backing us up. It's like having a co-pilot or someone that's
Sure.
sort of helping you trying to avoid making errors. So it can be quite useful from that point of view. So the advice would be it seems to get better and better all the time because there's a new one I was downloading on the weekend. I was talking to it and say, wow, this is quite helpful in mapping out a business plan or
Yeah.
finding the information on this. So I spent quite a while talking to it and said, wow, I learned a lot by
Yeah.
speaking to us, like having a
Sure.
student go research this, and it's
Yeah. Yeah.
back
Oh,
that
for
way.
sure.
So, I say it's kind of exciting in many ways about what we can do. I think it could be useful because that's one of the challenges we have. How do we scale the
Yeah.
company as well? And I think, in pathology, there's a shortage of pathologists. There's only half as many pathologists today as there were 10 years ago in
Wow.
America. And there's many countries that don't have any. So I think having these tools could make medicine better and more accessible and hopefully reduce the cost of it, because almost in every other industry, the cost of things go down over time, whereas in medicine, it's going up. Like there's got to be some kind of balance where we can maybe make medicine more accessible, more scalable, more effective. So I'm pretty excited about the AI future. So there's a lot of exciting things coming.
Excellent. Well, this has just been very enlightening, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for your contribution.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. Great questions, and we appreciate it. Thanks for having me on the program. Have a great rest of the day.
You too.
Thank you.